Hey all, I hope you're doing well. In this video, we're going to take a look at MCP. It's been gaining a lot of popularity recently, and with that rise, some legitimate security concerns are being raised. Is MCP a security nightmare? Well, let's take a look. MCP's basic proposition is to have LLMs access tools and resources on our behalf to accomplish useful tasks. If somebody tricks the LLM, they can compromise our resources and have the LLM run malicious commands and cause a great deal of damage. So the more permissions we grant the LLM, the greater and larger the attack surface becomes. MCP emphasizes the importance of keeping a human in the loop, basically having the AI application ask for permission and approval before taking actions. But it is very much like reading the terms and conditions. I don't expect everybody to go through each MCP request in great detail. The latest MCP specification, published in June 2025, brings a great deal of attention to security and authorization and focuses on OAuth2 and related RFCs. Let's take a look. Okay, so let's talk about OAuth. What problem is it trying to solve? So let's imagine you, the user, have an account with some identity provider, with some authorization server, let's call it Google. And there are some apps connected to this authorization server, such as Google Calendar or Google Drive. And there is some third-party app, a new app you just accessed. It's a productivity app. And you want to grant access to your calendar for that productivity app. So how can you accomplish that? Well, OAuth is the answer. So it goes like this. The productivity app redirects you to the authorization server, and it basically sends a client ID, meaning it identifies itself, and the client app, that productivity app, has already registered itself with Google, so it knows what's the app name, what does it do, what is its logo, and it adds that client ID to the authorization request, and it adds the resource or the permissions it's asking for, and that, in our case, it's the calendar. So when you access Google with that URL, Google asks you to log in and then shows you a screen saying, do you, the user, allow that productivity app, and it has all the info, the name, the description, and the logo, to access your resource, in our case, the calendar. And if you grant it permission, then the authorization server, Google, redirects you to the client app. And it knows that because while registering the client app, we provide a redirect URL. And in addition to redirecting you to the client app, the authorization server adds a code. And the client app can use that code to generate a token. So it basically takes the code and asks the authorization server, it proves with a secret that it is indeed the client app. I am the productivity app, and it asks for a token. That token represents the permission that you, the user, granted the client app, the productivity app, to access your resources, your calendar. And so the client app can now make a request to the calendar and add that token, that access token, to the request. And then once the calendar receives that token, it can either verify the token using cryptographic signatures, or it can even send a request to the authorization server asking if that token is indeed valid and does it grant the requested permission. If we replace the productivity app, the client, with an MCP client or with an LLM, and we replace the calendar with an MCP server, well, we have OAuth with MCP. So in the example we just described with the productivity and calendar apps, there were a few friction points. First of all, the MCP client needed to know both the MCP resource server and the authorization server. And usually you only know the MCP server, you don't care about the authorization server. Second friction point was that the client not only needed to know the authorization server, but it needed to have its various endpoints encoded within its logic. So the first authorization endpoint, and then the token exchange endpoint, and possibly the token verification, etc. And finally, the client needed to be registered beforehand with the authorization server. So the productivity app needed to register before the user attempted to use it. And in the MCP case, this is just not feasible because we can have multiple MCP servers, each with their own authorization server, and we cannot expect a user to register their MCP client with various authorization servers. So the MCP specification makes use of a few RFCs that address these specific problems. The user only has to know about the MCP server, the resource server, and when it tries to access it without authentication, the resource server responds with an unauthorized HTTP code, and it provides this resource metadata URL. This URL basically holds the authorization service information. So the client MCP queries this endpoint, and it gets the authorization server. Then once the user knows the authorization server, now it needs to know about the various endpoints to complete the OAuth2 flow. And this is what RFC 8414 does. It defines a well-known OAuth authorization server endpoint within the authorization server that holds all the necessary information that an OAuth2 client needs to know about an authorization server to go through the OAuth flow. And finally, we said that it's not really feasible or practical to have the MCP client register beforehand with the authorization server. So there is this cool RFC called Dynamic Client Registration, RFC 7591, which allows OAuth2 clients to register dynamically with OAuth server authorization servers. So it basically allows a client to indicate its name, its logo, its redirect URIs, and any relevant information to the OAuth server, and the OAuth server provides a client secret and client ID that the OAuth2 dynamic client can use later in its various requests. So the flow goes something like this. The MCP client tries to communicate with the MCP server. The server says you are not authorized and provides an OAuth protected resource URL. The client queries that and gets the authorization server URL. Then the client gets the authorization server info through the OAuth authorization server well-known endpoint. With this info, the client can go with the user through the OAuth2 flow. So the user is redirected to the authorized URL. It's prompted for their permission, and when they grant it, the authorization server redirects the user to the redirect URI of the client, and the client exchanges the code for an access token. Then the MCP client can use that access token to interact with the resource server, and the resource server can verify whether that access token is indeed valid by either verifying a signature or by doing a token introspection with the authorization server. Okay, let's take a look at an example. I'm going to use Auth0 as my authorization server, and I'm going to start an MCP server locally on port 8042, and I'm going to add that MCP server to my Cloud Desktop config. And when I open my Cloud Desktop, it's going to redirect me to my authorization server to ask for permission whether I, the user, want to grant the MCP CLI, the MCP client, access to my resources. And if I accept, I'm going to be redirected to the MCP client redirect URI, and the authorization server is going to provide the code that the MCP client is going to exchange for an access token, and it's going to use that access token to communicate with the MCP server to prove that indeed I, the user, have granted it permission. And we can take a look at my MCP server that I have started here on port 8042. And so when I opened up Cloud Desktop, it tried to access the MCP endpoint, but the MCP server responded with 401 unauthorized, and it provided the OAuth protected resource URI. and MCP client used that to get the authorization server URL, and it redirected me in the browser to basically ask for permission. Once it got the permission in the code, it exchanged that code for a token, and it adds that token to each request it makes to the MCP server, and that's what the token looked like. And in this particular example, the token is a JWT, a JSON Web Token, which is a JSON payload signed by the authorization server private key, and my resource server, my MCP server, can use the authorization server public key to verify that indeed this token is valid and grant my MCP client access to my resources. And that's pretty much it. I hope this has been informative, and thank you for watching. Bye-bye.